Well, hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my CE class that talks about the historical background before Jesus' arrival on the scene, and the second part here that talks about the historical background, what was going on in Judea while Jesus was doing his ministry, and then including when the early church was being started and Paul's ministry. I'm coming to you live from Judea in the background there, and my name is Mike Godfrey, and I'm the CE chair at Wexford Community Presbyterian Church. This is part 2, so if you're watching it immediately after part 1 and therefore are binge watching Christian education classes, then my work at WCPC is done. So I hope that is the case. I hope you enjoyed the first one. I hope you will enjoy the second one. I will now go and provide a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll share my screen, and hopefully everything will work, and we will get this party started. So, all right, so that was the last scheme. I don't know what that is about, so we'll keep going here. So the New Testament is Jewish historical background of the New Testament. This is part 2 of our series. So we had Herod the Great. He was the king of Judea. He was great because he built all the temple, remodeled the temple, I should say, renovated the temple in 20 BC, built Caesarea Maritima and other cities, and he dies in 4 BC. But not before he killed all the male babies of Bethlehem, because he was so jealous of this new king of the Jews that was born, that the Magi told him about. So after his death, his kingdom gets split. And the Romans decide to split Judea into 3 parts. Again, there's always fear that, what's going to come down the pike here? We want to split things up so that they couldn't really challenge us much, our rule in the area. So the Romans do a wise thing and split the kingdom up into 3 parts. And move me down to the corner here. And so the 3 parts are given over to 3 of Herod the Great's sons. And in one last act of cruelty to mankind, Herod the Great named all of these sons Herod to forever confuse those of us who read the Bible 2,000 years later. So he's just sort of like George Foreman, who named, I think, all 5 of his sons and his daughter, George. Herod named all of his kids Herod too. The 3 Herods were Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip II. Now, a lot of people, when you will read, don't call him Herod Philip II. They'll call him just Philip, or Philip the Tetrarch, and I'll talk about that. But in all of my research, he was called Herod the Philip II, and in the great course that I based this on, she refers to him as Herod Philip, and the Philip II is a designation that I think other historians use as well. So we're going to refer to him as Herod Philip II, and we'll talk about Herod Philip first a little bit, just a little bit, but we'll talk about that later. So I just wanted to show you, we have 3 kingdoms now, and the brown there is Herod Archelaus, where his kingdom is. Herod Archelaus gives the heart of Judea, where Jerusalem is. Where's Jerusalem? Right there. No, that's Bethlehem. Don't have my glasses on. Jerusalem's right there. So we've got Jerusalem right here in the heart of Herod Archelaus' territory, where Herod the Great ruled. This was the heart of his kingdom. And then we have Herod Antipas, who ruled in Lower Galilee, where Jesus did his ministry. And that'll become important later, of course. And then he rules down in here on the east side of the Jordan. And then up here is where Herod the Philip II reigned, and this is up near Syria. This is very Greek and mostly Gentiles up here. So hardly any Jews. Herod the Philip's up in Herod Philip II's up here, all by himself, and not really involved in any of the Jewish stuff. But he's an important figure in the Bible, and we'll find out why coming up. So that's the three kingdoms. Now, Herod Archelaus turned out to be a weak leader, and the Romans had the gall to exile him to Gaul. And Gaul is modern-day France. And they did this in 6 AD. And instead of naming another one of Herod's sons, I keep doing that, well, I'll talk about that later. Anyhow, even though they exiled him Gaul, before he leaves the scene, he does make it in the New Testament. And we read in Matthew 2:22, but when he, Joseph, of Joseph and Mary fame, heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod the Great, he, Joseph, was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into parts of Galilee. And that's from the King James Version. So, Galilee was ruled by Herod Antipas from 4 BC to 39 AD, and Rome introduced prefects to rule the heart of Judea in a more direct fashion, starting in 6 AD. So, as I said, instead of giving the heart of Judea to another one of Herod's sons, they said, listen, we're just going to rule it ourselves, but we're going to set up our headquarters in Caesarea Maritima on the coast. That way we have easy access to the Mediterranean and quick communication in the standards of the day with Rome, because they can just sail across the Mediterranean to deliver messages. And that city, Caesarea Maritima, was built by Herod the Great, and it was very Greek, and it was very stylish, and the Roman rulers, the Roman prefects, would have been very, very comfortable there. So, Herod Antipas, who ruled in Galilee, is mentioned, is the Herod that is mentioned in the Bible that fell in love with the wife of his half-brother, Herod Philip I. And as I say, I'm not going to say much about Herod Philip I, except to say that he should not be confused with Herod Philip II. So Herod Philip I, he kind of evaporates into history other than dying, and that Herod Antipas married his wife. And Herod Philip I's wife was named Herodias, simply because we do not have enough Herods to keep track of. John the Baptist, if you remember, criticized this marriage as unlawful, and Herod Antipas had him executed after some trickery instigated by his wife Herodias that used her daughter Salome. So you remember Salome danced for Herod Antipas, and he really liked it. And he said, I'll give you anything you want. And she said, bring me John the Baptist's head on a platter. And Herodias, his wife, put her daughter up that. That's just terrible. That's something my mother would say. Anyhow, homework. Read Matthew 14, 1 to 12 to get that story. So that's your assignment. Pontius Pilate. Let's talk about Pontius Pilate. He rules as the Roman prefect of Judea from 26 AD to 36 AD. And this is during the time when Jesus goes to Jerusalem during what we now call Holy Week. It starts with Palm Sunday and ends with Easter Sunday in the resurrection. During Holy Week, the Jewish leadership become very concerned about Jesus's growing power, and they want him to be executed and gotten rid of. But they can't do it because Jesus is now in the jurisdiction of Pontius Pilate. And to crucify someone, you would need Pilate to authorize it. So that's why they get Judas Iscariot to testify while they're in Pilate's territory, under his jurisdiction, to say that Jesus was claiming to be the Son of the God and create the charge that allows Pilate to put him to death. So again, going back to our map, there's Herod Archelaus' original territory. He's no longer in charge. This is the area that is now ruled by a Roman prefect, and that Roman prefect now is Pontius Pilate. So just to reiterate, and so this is where Herod Antipas had jurisdiction, but Herod Antipas is in control here. So if when the Jews decide during Holy Week to kill him, Herod Antipas has no authority to have him killed. And this is an artist's rendition of Judas Iscariot. And as I was doing this study, I thought, well, I need to sprinkle in some pictures now and then. And I was reading about Judas Iscariot and saw this picture of him. And I just thought, wow, the artist really captures what we think of Judas Iscariot and his shifty eyes there. And he's dark, and you can just see he's kind of a complicated man. And I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him, based on that picture. But I think he's a lot more complicated than that. And, there's a lot of debate about whether he was really doing God's will, because without his act, we do not set into motion the events that led to the crucifixion and resurrection. So there's a lot of deeper. And I think this painting is a very deep painting, and it's very complex, and so I really liked it. And anyhow, so Pilate and Herod Antipas, who has jurisdiction? So the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate interviews him. Okay, Pilate learns that Jesus is from Galilee, and Pilate says, I really don't want to get involved in this. I am going to send him back to Herod Antipas to handle the matter. And Herod Antipas happened to be in Jerusalem during this time, probably because it was Passover, and so he was there to celebrate Passover. So he happened to be in Jerusalem. Pilate knows that, and he sends it over to Herod Antipas to say, hey, you take care of this thing. Herod Antipas and the rest of the Sanhedrin want Jesus to be executed by Pilate in public as a common criminal to get rid of Jesus and his movement forever. Herod, therefore, says, I can't kill him because he's not my jurisdiction. I'm going to send him back to Pilate. So he does. And then Pilate, while Jesus is in Pilate's court, Pilate is a proxy for God, in my opinion, because Pilate finally relents to put Jesus to death, but he declares Jesus innocent. Pilate is figuratively standing in for God as Pilate declares his son innocent, and therefore the perfect sacrifice for the sins of mankind. And hopefully you read Malachi 1, and you will see about God's demand for a perfect sacrifice. And so his son was that perfect sacrifice, and Pilate declares him innocent. And I think that's just such a powerful scene in the Bible. And every time I read it, I'm always thinking, oh, Pilate, just let Jesus go. Just let Jesus go. I do that every Easter when I read of it. I think, oh, he's innocent. Please don't kill him. Please don't kill him. And but yet God, Pilate does go through with it. what's interesting, though, the Bible records this whole experience of passing Jesus back and forth led to Pilate and Herod to become best friends forever. It says in Luke 23:12, that day Herod, Antipas, and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. So an interesting side note, which is kind of crazy. So we're not done with Herods. We've got Herods and more Herods. We've got, and so I want to take us back to how Herod the Great killed two of his own sons by marrying the beautiful Hasmonean princess. Well, Herod did not kill the grandsons of Mariamne and Herod the Great. They ended up being sent to Rome to be educated among the elite, and that's kind of what the Jewish leadership would do, would send their sons to be educated in Rome to get sophisticated. And one of the grandsons was named Herod Agrippa I. And while in Rome, Herod Agrippa I was brought under the wing of Tiberius, the Roman emperor. He was the son-in-law of Caesar Augustus and educated along his son Gaius, who would eventually become emperor of Rome in 37 AD and who had the nickname Caligula. So I remember hearing Caligula a lot. That was actually Emperor Gaius, and Caligula was a crazy man. And you may hear a story about him, but it's just, I find it interesting that Caligula, this Roman emperor, has ties to our Judea history that we were learning about. And Herod Agrippa I was a playmate of Caligula and a sort of a brother to him. However, Herod Agrippa I was kind of a spoiled brat, and he got into debt and had to flee Rome, and he ends up back in Idumea, where his great-grandfather was from, and where his uncle Herod Antipas is the governor, and Herod Antipas says, I'll pay some of my deadbeat nephew's debts. And then Herod Agrippa wanders around a little bit, but he then ends up tutoring one of Tiberius's son, and he happens to say, I can't wait for Caligula to replace Tiberius as emperor. And they hear that, and he ends up getting thrown in jail. So after Tiberius dies, Caligula has Herod Agrippa released from prison and installed as king of his uncle Herod Philip II's territory. So if you remember, that's the territory to the north that's mostly Gentiles. It's up near Syria, and modern day Syria. So that's where Herod Agrippa becomes king, and he's given the title king. So now we remember Herodias of fame, and she is now Herod Antipas' wife, or still is Herod Antipas' wife, and she hears that Herod Agrippa I has been given the title of king, and she nags Herod Antipas to ask for that same title of king. And Herod Agrippa I learns of this. He doesn't like it. And so he slandered his uncle, Herod Antipas, to his good friend Caligula, that he went to school with back in Rome. And Caligula believes him, and therefore Herod Antipas is exiled to Spain, and Herod Agrippa I is given Herod Antipas' territory. So he's been given Herod Philip II's territory, and now Herod Antipas' territory. Okay, so Herod Agrippa, how does he fit in the New Testament? Do we see him anywhere? And he is mentioned, and he's mentioned in Acts 12, 1 through 3. About that time, Herod the king, and again, notice how the writers of the Bible don't differentiate that it's Herod Agrippa I. So we could be thinking it's Herod Archelaus, Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, but this time it's Herod Agrippa I. It says, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands upon someone who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he went to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And then also in Acts 12:20-23. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him in a body, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took a seat upon the throne, and made an oration to them, and the people shouted, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord smote him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. So Herod Agrippa the first was a vain man, and when they started to call him a god, he did not resist that, and he put himself on par with God, and because of that, the Lord smote him. I love that word, smote. All right, Herod Agrippa II, the last Herod. So we're finally running out of Herods. Herod Agrippa II. He's the son of Herod Agrippa I, as you might imagine. And Herod Agrippa II, was appointed as king of the Judean territories held by his father, by Emperor Claudius, the successor to Caligula, and also Caligula's uncle. So when Caligula died, Claudius took over, and Claudius was older than Caligula. He was passed over when Caligula became emperor, but he gets his chance after Caligula dies prematurely, and he takes over as emperor. Herod Agrippa II was fiercely pro-Roman, and he did so even against his fellow Jews. And after Emperor Nero succeeded Claudius, Nero extended Agrippa II's territory. So basically, Herod Agrippa II ended up with the same territory that Herod the Great had. He is also mentioned in the New Testament when Paul is arrested and ordered to stand trial. In Acts 26:1-3, we read, Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. "I think myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you are especially familiar with all customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." So that when Paul is talking to Herod, it's Agrippa II, not Agrippa I. So just a timeline recap here. Jesus was born in 4 BC under Herod the Great. Jesus' ministry from 27 to 30 AD is under Herod Antipas, John the Baptist too. The church is born in 30 AD. We have Saul, who becomes Paul, conversion. And just so you know there, Saul is the Jewish name of Saul of Tarsus, and Paul is the Greek version of Saul. And so it's not like God changed Saul's name to Paul. It's just that when Paul starts hanging around a bunch of Greeks, he becomes called by Paul, because that's what he's being called at that time. The way I think of this is when I was in French class in 9th grade, I had the French name Michel instead of Michael. And therefore in French class, because it was in French, I was called Michel. Well, everywhere else I was called Michael. It was the same name. It's just whether I was in French class or not. So anyhow, just to give you some perspective, we always think that maybe God changed Saul's name to Paul, just like God changed Jacob's name to Israel, but it's not at all the same thing. Okay, then the early church that is recorded in the second act of Acts occurs under Herod Agrippa I, and then the majority of Paul's letters are written in 50 to 60 AD to all of the churches he establishes as during his special mission to the Gentiles. And then Paul is martyred in 64 AD, and he goes to trial, and he makes his case to Herod Agrippa II that we just read. And then some more timelines. The Gospel of Mark, which is viewed as the first gospel written, is written about 65 to 70 AD. There's a major Jewish uprising in 70 AD that is not recorded in the Bible. And then we have the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and any Jewish self-rule is eliminated by the Romans in 70 AD. There's a crushing of the Jewish zealot holdouts at Masada in 74 AD, and that's a very dramatic scene as they commit suicide by throwing them off the dramatic cliffs at Masada. And Masada was built by Herod the Great. It was a fortress built by Herod the Great. And so that's a very famous story that if you have Jewish friends, ask them about Masada, they will probably be able to recount that dramatic story. And then we have the Gospel of Matthew written from 880 to 85, and the Gospel of Luke were also written about that time. And then the Gospel of John is 90 to 95, and then the Acts of the Apostles, which really is just the second part of Luke, it was also written at the time that Luke was written. And then we have Revelation that was written in 95 AD and is attributed to John, the beloved disciple on the Isle of Patmos. So that ends the narrative of Jesus during his time in Judea, his earthly ministry, and some of the background that went with us. And again, Jody Magnus and her class was a big source of this. If you'd like to borrow it from me, let me know. I'll be glad to give it to you. Or you can buy it at the Teaching Company online. The Great Courses, I think, is the website. Type that in and you can get it. The thing I would say is that all of these courses that are written by scholars, they are not written by believers, or at least they don't teach them as if they believe. They take a very strict historical approach, and so therefore they don't provide the same believers' take on events as I try and provide. But that's what I do in teaching, is that I take this very interesting historical information and I put it into the perspective of a believer, and hopefully it helps round out your faith and makes you interested to study more, because I really enjoy learning about Jesus and all the history related to the Bible. It's so fascinating, and it makes the Bible come alive so much more when you can tie all these things together. And that's the purpose of what I've tried to do here today with you. And please join us for adult Sunday school class, and when we get to meet back together. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I'll be glad to answer it. So again, thank you, and God bless you. Amen.